This is one of the most heartbreaking and horrifying cases of child murder the police had ever seen. 5-year-old Kamarie Holland had her entire life ahead of her, but it was stolen in the most brutal way imaginable. Who could commit such an unthinkable crime? And what really happened that tragic day? Watch until the end to learn the disturbing truth. What are your thoughts on this case? Should justice be even harsher for crimes like this? Share your opinions in the comments. Subscribe for more true crime cases that need to be heard.
A 5-year-old girl, full of life and promise, was sold for $2,500 to a man with a dark past. Her dreams of being a princess vanished in an instant. This story is not for the faint of heart, but it's a story that must be told. Kamarie Holland was just 5 years old, a child with dreams and innocence that should have been protected by those who were supposed to love her the most. But instead, her mother handed her over to a man whose life was steeped in violence and abuse, and in return, she was taken away from the world forever. What happened to Kamarie is not just a tragedy, it's a betrayal on the most fundamental level. It's a story of a mother who failed her daughter in the worst possible way. It's a story of a man with a criminal history who should never have had access to children. And yet, he did, thanks to a system that failed to see the signs until it was too late. Honestly, I wish I don't have to mention this part again. As we walk through this heart-wrenching case, we'll see it from multiple angles. Through the eyes of the grieving father, the investigators who pieced together the truth, and the disturbing reality of Kamarie's life before it was cut short. In every story, there are universal emotions we can all understand. The fear for our children, the disbelief that someone close to us could betray us, and the heartbreak when the innocent are taken away too soon. And while this case is unsettling, it's crucial that we face it. Because only by acknowledging these horrors can we begin to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Kamarie's story is one that cannot be ignored. But before we begin, I want to thank you, my amazing viewers and subscribers, for your support through your likes, shares, and comments. Your engagements help make these stories more meaningful. If you're new here, be sure to hit that. Kamarie Holland was a little girl with a heart full of hope. Bright eyes, a smile that could light up the room. She was 5, and the world was her playground. She wasn't bogged down by the harsh realities of life, not yet. In her mind, she was a princess, like the ones in the stories she loved. A princess with a future she would never get to see. Kamarie lived with her father, Corey Holland, in Phoenix City, Alabama. Corey was a devoted father, the kind of dad who would do anything for his kids. He was the kind of father who was always there, waking up early, making breakfast, helping with homework, and making sure Kamarie felt safe and loved. Corey had an unshakable bond with his daughter, one that was filled with care and protection. He was the steady foundation in Kamarie's life. Despite the challenges life threw his way, Corey did everything he could to be a good parent. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. For Kamarie, it was more than enough. She loved spending time with her father, and he made her feel special every single day. Their relationship was strong, one built on trust, affection, and an unspoken promise of safety. But then came the weekend. The weekend when Kamarie would go to her mother's house. She was excited. She couldn't wait. For a little girl, there was something thrilling about a visit to Mom's house, especially when it meant a break from the everyday routine. Corey was hesitant, as he always was, but seeing how happy Kamarie was, he relented. He knew that her mother, Christy, would take care of her. At least that's what he hoped. What Corey didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this visit would be the last time he'd see his little girl alive. The relationship between Kamarie's parents, Corey and Christy, was complicated. It wasn't filled with the love and harmony you'd expect for the sake of their children. It was a relationship marked by tension and strain, a product of too many misunderstandings, broken promises, and unhealed wounds. Corey had a deep love for Kamarie, but he also had deep concerns about Christy. Christy had her own struggles, ones that no child should ever have to bear witness to. Her battles with substance abuse were no secret, and they cast a dark shadow over her ability to care for her children. Christy wasn't always there when it mattered most. Her inability to stay grounded led to decisions that Corey couldn't understand. For all the love she might have had for her children, it was clear that her addiction had taken precedence in her life. There were moments when Corey would try to talk to Christy about Kamarie's well-being, about her future, but it felt like Christy wasn't ready to listen. Her struggles with addiction affected not only her relationship with Corey, but also her ability to be the kind of mother Kamarie deserved. Corey worried constantly. He knew Kamarie needed a stable environment, one that Christy couldn't always provide. Despite this, Corey allowed Kamarie to go with Christy that weekend. He saw how happy Kamarie was at the thought of spending time with her mom, and he hoped, he prayed, that things would be different this time. What was meant to be a weekend visit turned into something that no parent should ever have to face, a nightmare. But at the time, all Corey could think of was his daughter's excitement, not the horrific events that would unfold just hours later. It was December 12th, 2021, a Sunday, a day that should have been like any other. But for Corey, it wasn't just another weekend. It was the day he had to make a decision he'd regret for the rest of his life. Christy, Kamarie's mother, showed up at his door to take their daughter for the weekend. Despite the custody arrangement, something Corey had fought so hard for, Christy still had visitation rights. It was always a delicate balance, and Corey knew that Kamarie's excitement was hard to ignore. His daughter practically bounced up and down with joy when she saw her mother standing at the door. She ran to Christy, wrapping her arms around her with that same innocent enthusiasm Corey had seen 100 times before. Corey felt a weight in his chest, a familiar ache in his heart as he watched them. Part of him wanted to say no, to hold Kamarie close and keep her safe. But the other part, his love for her, his desire to see her happy, pulled him in the other direction. Kamarie was thrilled at the idea of spending time with her mother, and who was he to stand in the way of that? So he let her go. With one last kiss, one final wave, Kamarie was off, excited to see her mom. Corey stood there at the door, watching them leave, the unease creeping back in like a dark shadow. Christy's home in Columbus, Georgia wasn't much. It was a small place, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, but it was far from the stable environment Kamarie needed. There was always a sense of disarray when you stepped inside. The clutter, the sense of something missing, a feeling that things were never quite in order. It was as if Christy was trying to hold things together, but the threads were constantly slipping through her fingers. The morning of December 13th, 2021, Christy Sipple awoke to an empty house. She glanced at the clock, 6 a.m. Her first thought was of Kamarie, her little girl who should have been there, tucked safely in bed. But as she walked into the living room, something wasn't right. The door to the house was wide open and Kamarie was gone. Panic set in. Christy rushed to check the house, searching for any sign of her daughter. Nothing. No sign of struggle, no trace of where Kamarie might have gone, only the unsettling feeling that something was terribly wrong. Without a second thought, Christy dialed 911, her voice shaking as she reported Kamarie missing. "My daughter is gone," she said. "I woke up and she was just gone." The dispatcher on the other end tried to calm her, asking for details, where she had last seen Kamarie, what time she had gone to bed. Christy told the story as best as she could, her words rushed, frantic, and laced with confusion. She didn't understand what had happened. Kamarie was there when she fell asleep. How could she just vanish? But as soon as the police arrived, the scene became more complicated. The response from the Columbus Police Department was swift, but something felt off. Officers combed the area around Christy's home, but there were no immediate leads, no signs of a break-in, nothing that pointed to an abduction. The case quickly moved from being a missing child to something more unsettling. Phoenix City authorities were called in to assist, and soon a task force was formed to investigate. The investigation moved quickly, with the Columbus Police and Phoenix City authorities collaborating to trace every lead. Phone records, surveillance footage, and interviews with neighbors began to paint a different picture. Christy's claim that the door had been left open, that Camari had vanished in the night, those details didn't hold up. However, the breakthrough came when investigators connected Christy to a man named Jeremy Williams. He was a name they'd heard before. In 2005, Williams was living in Alaska, and his history was chilling. suspected in the death of his own daughter, though there was never enough evidence to press charges. And it didn't stop there. In 2009, while living in Phoenix City, he had been accused of abusing a 3-year-old boy, but again, the case fell apart due to lack of evidence. Williams had a pattern, a dark history that kept coming back to haunt him. As the pieces began to fall into place, Christie's story became harder to believe. Investigators uncovered surveillance footage from nearby cameras showing Christie and Jeremy together on the night of Kamarie's disappearance. It wasn't just a casual acquaintance. There was a connection, something more than what Christie had initially led them to believe. And this wasn't the first time her judgment had been questioned. Then came the most disturbing detail of all: Kamarie's toys. The day after her daughter's death, Christie, rather than grieving, was seen gathering Kamarie's things, her beloved toys, and donating them to a local charity. It was an odd move. Parents who've just lost a child don't usually rush to give away their child's possessions, especially not when their death was still so fresh. This action alone raised suspicions, casting an even darker shadow over Christie's involvement. Christie's criminal past only added to the growing evidence. She wasn't a stranger to trouble with the law. In 2018, she had been charged with child neglect after her newborn tested positive for methamphetamines. And the charges didn't stop there. Reports revealed that Christie had a history of failing to appear in court for child endangerment cases. It was clear Christie had not been the type of mother Kamarie deserved. The more the police uncovered, the clearer it became. Christie wasn't just an unfortunate mother caught up in a tragic situation. She was a woman with a history of making poor, often dangerous decisions. And now, it seemed those decisions had led to the ultimate betrayal: the death of her own daughter. The questions that had swirled around her in the beginning were now being replaced by a more horrifying truth. Christie had handed her daughter over to a man with a history of violence and abuse, and now Kamarie was gone forever. As police continued their investigation, they discovered Jeremy and Christie's connection went deeper than they'd initially thought. They weren't just acquaintances. They were close. Jeremy was someone Christie trusted, someone she had allowed into her life, and the more the police uncovered, the more they realized he might have been involved in more than just Kamarie's disappearance. Could he have been orchestrating this all along, using Christie to gain access to Kamarie? The truth was still just out of reach, but the pieces were falling into place, each one more chilling than the last. Then on December 14th, 2021, just one day after Kamarie's disappearance, the police received the call that no parent should ever hear. They'd found Kamarie's body. The house where they found her was a shell of neglect, cold and abandoned. A place that felt forgotten, as if the world had turned its back on it long ago. It sat on the outskirts, isolated from the rest of the neighborhood, just like the horrors that had taken place within its walls. No one had lived there for some time. And yet, on that night, it became the final resting place for a 5-year-old girl. Kamarie's body was discovered in the basement, and the scene was as horrific as it was heartbreaking. She had been brutally strangled with a ligature, the cold air in the house unable to provide any comfort to her tiny, lifeless form. But it wasn't just the way she was killed, it was the abuse she had endured before her death. This was a child who had been robbed of everything: her future, her innocence, and most tragically, her safety. For Kamarie's father, Corey, the news was a gut punch. To find out that his little girl, the daughter he'd fought so hard to protect, had been taken in such a brutal, senseless way, he couldn't comprehend it. The pain was so deep, so raw, that it felt as if his heart had been ripped out. He had trusted Christie, he had trusted that Kamarie would be safe, and now she was gone. The grief, the guilt, the disbelief, it consumed him. And the community, too, was in shock. Columbus and Phoenix City had been shaken to their core. They had watched Kamarie grow up, seen her run through the streets with that same wide-eyed joy that belonged to all children. Now, they had to face the fact that a child they once knew was gone. A child whose life had been stolen away by people who were supposed to protect her. The discovery of Kamarie's body marked a turning point in the investigation. It was no longer about finding a missing child. It was about finding justice for a little girl who had been failed by the very people who should have loved her the most. The case was no longer just another tragic loss. It was a call for accountability, for the truth to come out, no matter how dark it might be. Jeremy Williams had been on the run for a few days, but it wasn't long before the authorities closed in. On December 15th, 2021, less than 48 hours after Kamarie's body was found, Jeremy was tracked to a dingy motel in Phoenix City, Alabama. The Bamboo Motel, a rundown place, the kind of spot you wouldn't want to stay in unless you had nowhere else to go. Jeremy had checked in just hours before, and when law enforcement arrived, they found him there, hiding in plain sight. The capture was almost anticlimactic. There was no grand chase, no frantic escape, just the cold reality that the authorities knew exactly where he was, and it was only a matter of time before they got him. When the officers entered his room, Jeremy didn't try to run. Instead, he seemed resigned, almost as if he knew the inevitable had come. They took him into custody, and as soon as they did, the tension in the air thickened. The questions came quickly, and Jeremy's responses were slow, deliberate, as if he was trying to hold something back. But detectives weren't fooled. They could see the cracks in his story, the lies beginning to unravel. His mind had already begun to betray him. The interrogation started with the basics. Where had he been the night Camari went missing? What was his involvement? Jeremy seemed calm at first, but it didn't take long for the facade to crumble. The man who had been living with the weight of his own criminal past slowly started revealing more than he intended. Jeremy admitted his role in Kamarie's death, though his words came with an unsettling, almost casual tone. He spoke about his actions like they were an afterthought, as if it was just another terrible thing he'd done in a long line of worse decisions. What shocked investigators, though, wasn't just his admission. It was the alarming detail in his confession. He had no remorse, only a strange, cold indifference. Jeremy spoke of Kamarie as if she were just another victim in his cycle of abuse, no different from the others he had hurt over the years. His history of sexual abuse wasn't just some rumor. It was a well-documented trail of pain that led back years. Too many victims, too many broken lives. As the interrogation continued, the officers pushed harder. They wanted answers, not just about Kamarie, but about everything Jeremy had done. His involvement in other cases, the ones that were dismissed, the ones that still haunted his past, those cases were now being reopened. Jeremy's arrest had turned the spotlight on him again, and investigators were beginning to piece together the full picture of his depravity. They knew he was connected to several other crimes, including the unsolved deaths and abuse cases stretching back over a decade. The disturbing thing? Each time, Jeremy had slipped through the cracks. Just enough doubt, just enough misdirection for him to walk free. But now, everything was changing. With the confession out in the open, the police were ready to dig deeper, to connect the dots between his past and the horrors he had inflicted. His days of hiding were over. As the investigation continued to unfold, authorities began to piece together more than just Jeremy Williams's horrifying role in Kamarie's death. They soon discovered Christy Siepel's deeper involvement in the crime, her role in the human trafficking of her own daughter. It wasn't just that she had allowed Kamarie to go with Jeremy. It was that she had actively sold her daughter for money, making a decision that would cost Kamarie her life. The truth hit the community like a freight train. Christy, the mother everyone thought was a victim herself, was revealed to be an active participant in her daughter's suffering. It wasn't just neglect or poor judgment. Christy had knowingly handed her child over to a man with a criminal history, a man who would do unspeakable things to Kamarie, and for what? A quick sum of money, a trade that cost Kamarie everything. The shock was overwhelming. No one could believe that a mother, someone who should have protected her child at all costs, could betray her like this. Christy's actions were nothing short of unforgivable. People couldn't understand how a mother could stand by, not only allowing this horrific act to take place, but actively facilitating it. It shattered the community's sense of safety, their trust in the people they thought they knew. For Corey, the revelation was devastating. For months, he had hoped that Christy's failure to care for Kamarie was a result of her addictions or circumstances. But learning that Christy had been complicit in Kamarie's death, the woman who had once promised to love and protect her, was a blow that left Corey reeling. The man who had spent every day trying to protect his daughter now faced the agonizing reality that the very woman he had once trusted with his child had played a direct role in her demise. He was angry, but it was the grief that consumed him. How could he ever forgive Christy for what she did to Kamarie? Could he even begin to comprehend the loss of a daughter at the hands of a mother? But as the case moved to court, the legal fallout started to unfold. Jeremy Williams' trial began with an unexpected plea. He didn't deny his actions, but instead pleaded not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. They wanted him to face the full weight of his crimes. The idea that he might escape accountability for what he did because of his mental state caused an uproar. The court of public opinion wasn't swayed by his plea. The people who had followed this case from the beginning wanted justice, and they weren't about to let a legal loophole allow this man to escape his fate. Jeremy Williams was charged with multiple serious offenses, including first-degree capital murder, human trafficking, abuse of a corpse, and more. So April 24, 2024, Jeremy Williams was sentenced to 4 death sentences for his crimes related to the murder and abuse of Kamarie Holland. He will likely spend years on death row before facing his execution, as the process can take time in the United States. Although in a more recent news thing, in December 2024, it was reported that Williams was appealing his sentence, with the state providing an attorney for his defense. As for Christy, the legal proceedings went in a direction that no one could have predicted. In an unexpected move, she pleaded guilty to human trafficking. She didn't contest the charges, and the full extent of her role in the crime was laid bare for all to see. She was facing serious charges, but the worst part was the light sentence she could potentially receive. As the charges were read, many people in the courtroom were left in disbelief. How could a mother who had sold her own child, enabling the horrific abuse and eventual murder, receive just 20 years in prison? It seemed like a slap in the face to Kamarie's memory and to Corey, who had fought so hard to keep his daughter safe. The public outrage was intense. Many people felt Christy deserved far more than a mere 20 years. How could society allow someone who had contributed to such a heinous crime to face such a short sentence? People were angry, not just at Christy, but at the justice system that seemed to fail Kamarie at every turn. It was a slap in the face to everyone who knew Kamarie, everyone who had believed that she deserved a chance at life. Corey Holland's grief was unlike anything anyone could truly understand unless they had lived it. It was a quiet kind of suffering, the kind that wraps around your chest and doesn't let go. The loss of Camari was like a hole that would never fill, and every day, Corey faced the weight of his decision to let her go to Christy that weekend. He had been a loving father, always there for Camari, doing his best to provide for her, to make her feel safe. And yet, despite all his efforts, there was that voice in his head asking, what if? What if I'd kept her with me that weekend? What if I hadn't let her go? It wasn't just the death of his daughter that hurt. It was the weight of feeling like he had failed her when she needed him the most. That voice would never stop. That guilt would always linger, no matter how hard he tried to move forward. As the trial faded and the legal proceedings came to a close, the moral questions lingered. How could a mother betray her own child? How could Christy Sipple, a woman who should have been Kamarie's protector, allow such horrors to unfold? The very thought seemed impossible to grasp. There's a part of us that wants to believe that people are born good, that somewhere, deep down, everyone has the capacity for love and decency. But Christy's actions didn't just shock the community, they challenged that belief. Could we ever understand why she did what she did? Or was she simply evil, unable to see the damage she was causing? As the story of Kamarie's life ends in tragedy, we are left with this painful reflection. How do we stop this from happening again? How do we protect children, the most vulnerable among us, from people who would exploit them, harm them, or in the most unimaginable way, sell them for a price? The answer isn't easy, but it starts with awareness, with making sure these crimes don't slip through the cracks of the system, with demanding better for our children. Kamarie's life was full of potential, of love, of joy. She was a princess in the making, full of hope and dreams. Her life was stolen, her innocence shattered by those who should have protected her. And as we reflect on her story, we remember the child who had so much to give, a little girl who never had the chance to see her dreams come true. We remember Kamarie Holland, not as a victim, but as a light that will forever shine in the hearts of those who loved her. In 2021 alone, Georgia saw 106,948 reports of child abuse and neglect. Out of these, over 9,800 cases were confirmed to be true, and an additional 38,800 children were provided with alternative responses, like family support services. What's even more disturbing is that 64% of these cases were due to neglect, meaning parents or guardians weren't just failing to protect their children, they were leaving them vulnerable, with no one to step in. Now, this isn't just a state issue, it's a community issue. Let's focus on Columbus, Georgia, the city at the center of Kamarie's story. In Muskogee County, which covers Columbus, there were 1,870 reports of child maltreatment in just 1 year, affecting over 1,600 children. The rate of abuse here is higher than the state average, sitting at 30.9 per 10,000 children. That's more children affected, more families torn apart. And 184 kids were removed from their homes during this time, many due to neglect and the dangers posed by substance abuse. But this is more than just numbers. It's about the children, the real faces and futures behind these statistics. The truth is, things can be better. There are ways to stop tragedies like this from happening. Education and resources are key. Providing parents with the tools they need to raise healthy, happy children is critical. If we can offer mental health services, substance abuse treatment, and parenting support to families in need, we can prevent situations like this from escalating. But it doesn't stop there. It's also about strengthening the system, making sure child protective services have the support they need to respond faster, more effectively, and with more resources. It's about ensuring that every child is protected, not just those who are already in danger, but also those who might be at risk. We can't afford to be passive any longer. We remember Kamarie Holland, not just as a victim, but as a symbol of all the children we need to protect. Her dreams, her innocence, her promise, they were all taken from her. But her story isn't just about loss. It's about what we can do to make sure other children never face the same fate. Camari was a little girl with dreams of being a princess, and while her life was tragically cut short, we owe it to her, and every child like her, to make sure their futures are brighter. What do you think about this case? Let's hear your thoughts in the comment section.